Okay, so welcome to Flower Gardening for Beginners. Before I get started, I want to introduce myself and my co-presenter, Katie Hanlon. We are both longtime gardeners, passionate about plants, passionate about the environment. We're also both master gardeners. In fact, that's where we met, taking the Yukon Master Gardener class in 2014, and we are both members of the Orchard Valley Garden Club here in Southington. In fact, Katie is a past president of the Orchard Valley Garden Club. And the reason we are doing these programs is because one of our newer members, who is herself not a very experienced gardener, suggested that garden club members present to the garden club or to the public some informational series about getting started with gardening. So our first one was on getting started with vegetable gardening, and today's is about getting started with flowers. The idea is to get you excited about planting flowers, to give you the basics to get started, and perhaps to give you an idea of how much fun it can be. Because I have to say, although I enjoy planting vegetables, I love my flowers. And if I had to choose between vegetable gardening or flower gardening would win hands down. So when you're starting a flower garden, you need to think about what your goals are when you're making your choices. So one goal could be to create a beautiful view in your yard. Maybe a view out your living room window or from the kitchen sink when you're doing dishes, maybe from a seating area or a pool deck or a backyard deck. If you want to add some color and something pretty to look at, that's one goal for flower gardening. Another would be to improve the look of your property, add a little curb appeal, maybe some flowers around your mailbox, near your front door, along the driveway. Perhaps you have an ugly feature that you want to hide, an air conditioning unit, a propane tank, a wellhead, something that could use some camouflage, and flowers are a way to do that. Perhaps you've heard about the plight of our native pollinators, or that bird populations have been declining in the last decade, or that scientists are recognizing what they're calling the insect apocalypse, where insect species are reduced in numbers. All of these might make you think about supporting wildlife pollinators, birds in your yard. Your yard can be more than a pretty place. It can be a habitat for these creatures. And if that is your goal, then there are some specific choices that you need to make as you're planning your garden. Now, this is a big topic that we will cover in a subsequent presentation, but a little information can maybe get you started with that. First of all, if you want to attract pollinators, you need to plant plants that produce pollen. And that seems like a no-brainer, but in fact, there are flowers that don't. Modern plant breeders have created varieties that have double forms because they're beautiful, but it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for bees and butterflies to get at the pollen. And they have also created varieties that are sterile. Sterile varieties will bloom longer because they don't have to waste energy on producing seeds, but they are useless to pollinators. So you need to pick plants that produce pollen. Native plants are always best for birds and pollinators because these creatures have evolved over millions of years with the plants that live in this area. And many of them need specific plants that will grow in this area to survive, to complete their life cycles. Then you need to reduce or eliminate completely any pesticide and herbicide use, because there's no sense planting flowers that will attract pollinators to your yard and then killing them off by spraying them with pesticides. It's a good idea to plant in masses of flowers instead of a plant here, a plant there, a plant there. A large group attracts more pollinators, and the pollinators use a lot of energy going from plant to plant. So if they can stay in one area, they can focus their energy on obtaining the pollen instead of flying from plant to plant. Wildlife, birds, and bees and butterflies all need a water source of some kind, a bird bath, a shallow pan with pebbles and water in it. And they need shelter. For birds, that would be shrubs that they can hide in to keep away from predators. For insects and pollinators, it's leaf litter. If your garden is perfectly tidy and you don't leave any leaves that fall, the many native pollinators and butterflies overwinter in the leaf litter. So if you clean all that up, you're eliminating a place for them to survive the winter. Another goal for planting a flower garden would be to grow cut flowers, flowers that you're going to be bringing in vases for your house. So when you're planting for cut flowers, you want to consider flowers that are going to bloom for a long time, that have long stems, and that hold well in water. So lots of bulbs are good cut flowers, daffodils, tulips in the spring, gladiola in the summer. Annuals are great cut flowers because they have a long bloom time. So zinnias, cosmos, snapdragons, which is what's pictured here, salvia, sunflower, all of those make good cut flowers. And then perennials such as black-eyed Susan, coneflower, taller varieties of sedum, daisies, yarrow, coreopsis, all of those are good in vases. And then don't forget the greens. A vase of flowers always looks better when it's filled with supporting greens to set off the blooms. So if you have an area with ferns or hostas or something with a fairly large leaf, that will look good in a vase. And then another reason for planting a flower garden is for the sentimental value. Perhaps there's a childhood memory associated with a plant that you want to put in your yard, or a flower that your mother or your grandmother or friend always grew. Those are wonderful things to put in your yard. And finally, it's just wonderful to experience the joy of growing flowers. There's nothing better than taking a seedling or a small transplant and watching it get bigger and stronger and produce beautiful flowers in your yard. It's just a wonderful thing. So when you're planning your garden, you need to think about what your limitations are. And the first one to consider is location. Where is your garden going to be in your yard? Are you starting from scratch? Maybe you haven't had a flower garden before, your yard is mostly lawn, or are you adding to existing garden? There are pros and cons for both situations. I mean, it can be rather daunting to have a blank slate, you know, a totally featureless yard that you want to add some flowers to. It's hard to think about, where am I going to start? What shape is the garden going to be? Where am I going to put it? On the other hand, if you're adding to a garden that's already there, you've got to work around the plants that are already there. And that can be challenging as well. Sometimes what's already there is not something that you can work with. It might be tree roots that you can't plant under, or there might be noxious weeds, poison ivy, invasive species that you have to eradicate before you can plant the garden. So that's something to think about as well. And sometimes it can take more than one season to eradicate the weeds that are going to get in the way of a successful garden. Then you need to think about where your garden will be seen from. Is it going to be up close to the house where you will pass it every day? In which case, you know, you're going to need to choose flowers that are going to look good and foliage that's going to look good all the time, because you're going to see it all the time. An advantage to that is you're also going to be more likely to keep it nice and clean and neat and weeded. It's easy to forget about a garden that's off in the distance. If you've got a garden that is at the far end of your yard, are you going to remember to weed it? The garden in the picture here is at the far end of my yard, and I can see it from the living room. So when I planted it some 40 years ago, I picked all blue flowers because I love blue flowers. And what I discovered was that the blue flowers disappeared in the distance. They just weren't noticeable. They were too small, they were too dark, it was a little bit shaded, and it was like a sea of green instead of bright flowers. So I redid the garden and I made different choices. I chose brighter, lighter colors, and that's much more visible from a distance. Then you need to think about whether the location you've chosen will be easy to maintain. Is it going to be far from a water source where you're going to have to lug hoses or watering cans out to the garden? That's something to consider. Is it difficult to reach? Is it on a slope? All of those things are things to think about when you're planning your garden. Another limitation for a flower garden can be the available space, depending on the size of your yard and the other features in your yard. But it's also one of the limitations that's easier to get around because there are lots of options. Container planting is a great option if your space is limited. Your entire garden could be in containers. Window boxes, hanging baskets, patio pots are great choices and easy to maintain. You can use vertical space for your flower garden. There are lots of flowering vines that grow well on trellises right up against a wall or on fences. You don't need a lot of space for that. I always advise people to reduce their lawn because lawns are a very sterile part of the landscape. They support no creatures. It's not a habitat. And if you cut back your lawn, you have less mowing to do as well. And finally, you should match the size of the plants you choose to the available space. Different flowers come in different sizes, and the same flower can come in different sizes. Zinnias for purchase at garden centers can grow to 8 inches tall, or they can grow to 4 feet tall. So you just need to choose the flowering plant that makes sense for the size of your garden. Another limitation to consider is how much time and effort can you put into your garden? Now, there's no garden that's completely maintenance-free, but there are many plants that come close to being maintenance-free. And there are also tricks that you can use to reduce the amount of maintenance and time you need to put into the garden. Things such as using mulch to reduce the amount of weeding you need to do and the amount of water that the plants need. Soaker hoses that can be left in place and turned on once or twice a week. Making reliable choices in plants that bloom easily without a lot of care. So easy care annuals would include things like nasturtiums, portulaca, impatiens, begonias, cosmos, zinnias, marigolds, and salvia. Those are all things that don't take a lot of know-how to grow, don't take a lot of care during the growing season, and are very reliable. And there are plenty of easy care perennials as well. And perennials have, of course, the advantage of being planted once, whereas annuals have to be planted every year. So I would consider Shasta daisies, coreopsis, daylilies, black-eyed Susan, catmint, butterfly weed, and sedum to be very easy care perennials. Another consideration when you're planning a flower garden is what kind of financial investment you want to make in the garden. If you're starting from scratch, if you've never gardened before, you do need to make some initial investments in terms of tools and equipment, hoses, shovels, rakes, that kind of thing. But you pay for them once up front and you'll be able to use them for years. And then there's the cost of plants. But there are ways to save money on plants. So you need to think about the initial expense versus a long-term investment. One way to save money on plants is to grow your flowers from seed put directly in the ground, as opposed to buying purchase plants. Now that would be annuals in most cases, because perennials grown from seed do not typically bloom the first year and may not bloom the second year either. So it's a long-term endeavor. But there are annuals that if you plant them by seed in the spring, you will get flowers that first season. You do have to understand, though, that if you're direct seeding plants such as marigolds, zinnias, or nasturtiums, it takes a while for them to bloom. Whereas if you buy 6-packs at the nursery, they'll bloom much faster. So you may not get flowers until August, and that needs to be considered. But it is a way to save money because packages of seeds are very inexpensive. You can also choose smaller pots of plants, because the bigger the pot, the more expensive the purchase is. Now, the bigger the pot, the faster you're going to see flowers, the more impact it will have in your garden. But one way to save money is to buy smaller plants and be patient and wait for them to grow. And then there are friends, neighbors, and relatives. They're great sources for inexpensive, free plants. Some of my best plants came from friends and family. And every time I see them, I remember those people. So that's a benefit as well. One caveat for getting plants from friends is that you really need to be careful that you don't pick up any hitchhikers along with the plant. UConn now recommends that when sharing plants, that the plants be shared bare root. In other words, with no soil around the roots of the plant. And that's so that you don't accidentally introduce a noxious weed or an invasive insect when you're sharing the plant. And finally, local plant sales are a great way to get inexpensive plants. And here I have to put in a plug for my garden club's annual plant sale. Every May, we have a plant sale at the Calendar House in Southington, and we sell annuals, perennials, and vegetables. Most of the plants come from our own gardens, so you know they're easy to grow right here in Southington. And they also come with expert advice, because our members know a lot about plants, and they can give you advice and answer your questions. So it's a win-win. This year's plant sale is on Saturday, May 21st at the Calendar House from 8:30 to 12:30. Now, you've heard me mention some different types of garden plants, so I think it's a good time to stop and talk about those different kinds of plants and what I mean by those plants. Annuals, tropicals, and I would include half-hardy perennials in this group. These are plants that will grow for you for one season because they won't live over the winter. There are annuals that are frost tolerant that can be put out when it's quite chilly, like right now you can put pansies in your garden and they will be okay even when it goes down below freezing. But most annuals you plant after the last danger of frost has passed. And then when we have frost again in October, they will die, and they only live for one season. Perennials, on the other hand, come back every year. So you plant them once and you can enjoy them from then on. Perennials are frost tolerant, and as long as you check the appropriate zone, they are appropriate for our planting zone. So that means you're going to be looking for perennials that are hardy in zone 5B or greater. That Connecticut, where we live, is zone 5B. So if you see on the plant tag, hardy from zone 4 to 7, you're good. There are some plants that can't take the heat, and so that's what the upper level number is. So 4 to 7, 7 would be like down in South Carolina or something like that. Further south than that, the plant won't be happy. So perennials are flowering plants that come back every year. And then there are biennials. Biennials are sort of halfway between. They live for 2 years. The first year they produce foliage only, no flowers. They live through the winter. They come back the second year, and the second year they bloom, produce seed, and then they die at the end of the season. So that would be some varieties of hollyhocks, foxgloves. I don't know if you've heard of money plant. Those are biennials. And then there are flowering plants that come from fleshy underground parts, such as bulbs, tubers, and corms. So bulbs would be zinnias and tulips. Tubers would be dahlias. Rhizomes would be included in that. That would be German bearded iris, grow from rhizomes. Corms would be gladiolas. Some of these you plant once, such as daffodils and tulips, and they'll come back every year. Same with the iris. Others you have to lift at the end of the season and put in a protected place, such as an unheated garage or basement, and then replant in the spring. Flowering shrubs are a great part of your garden, and they, again, like perennials, are planted once and then you can enjoy them for years afterwards. Foliage plants and grasses can be a great part of a flower garden. Even though they don't produce flowers, the foliage can set off your blooms and provide interest when things are not blooming. So that would be things like hostas or ornamental grasses. And finally, there are the ground covers. Most people, when you mention ground covers, they think of things like pachysandra. But there are plenty of flowering ground covers that can do double duty in your yard. They can cover an area and keep the weeds down and also bloom. So that would be things like periwinkle, the ground cover sedums, the golden star. Ground covers are a great way to add some color to your yard. The best flower gardens are the ones that give you something of interest all season long. So right from spring through fall, and maybe even some winter interest. If you choose your plants appropriately, you'll have something blooming all from early spring to late fall. So the spring bloomers would be your bulbs, tulips, daffodils, crocuses, that kind of thing. Hardy, frost-tolerant annuals, such as alyssum and pansies, and early perennials, such as bleeding heart and columbine. Then for summer bloomers, you're looking for annuals that you would plant once frost is past, and summer blooming perennials like daisies and coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. And then there are the fall bloomers, asters, mums, sedum, goldenrod, that can give you color right up to November. When you're choosing your plants, it's important to think about how much light you have and to make sure you're picking the right plant for the right place. If you love zinnias, but you've got a shady yard, you're setting yourself up for disappointment to try to grow them. But impatiens will give you some beautiful flowers. There are blooming plants for just about every light exposure. You just have to look for them. The full sun ones are the easiest. That's the most numerous. Full sun means 6 hours of direct sun every day. Part sun would be between 4 and 6 hours of direct sun every day. Part shade between 2 and 4 hours, and then full shade would be less than 2 hours of sun. You have to look harder to find blooming plants that will bloom in part shade or full shade, but they do exist. You just have to look for them. And if you can learn to love interesting foliage textures and colors, you can have a beautiful garden with just foliage plants like hostas and ferns. Soil is very important to any garden, and also important to flower gardens. If you have good soil, your plants will thrive. If you have poor soil, your plants will struggle. And we always recommend that you test your soil before you start a garden and periodically thereafter. UConn has a soil testing service. If you go to ladybug.uconn.edu, they give the instructions for collecting the soil samples. It costs $15, and they will send you a report by email with detailed information about the composition of your soil and what you need to do to improve it for whatever crop or plant you're going to grow. The Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station will do tests for free. And this is the web address for the Ag Station. UConn gives a somewhat more detailed report than the Ag Station does, but they both give you basic information about the kind and amount of fertilizer to apply and the kind and amount of lime to use, because it's very important to match the acidity or alkalinity of your soil to the type of plant you're growing. Most flowers have particular wants and desires. Some like acid soil, some like a more neutral soil, and you need to match that to the type of plant so that the fertilizer you use is available to the plants. Once you get your test results, then you add fertilizer and lime and maybe organic matter to your soil according to the test results. Now, it's important to test your soil early because they get very busy this time of year. So now is the time to do it. The soil is not frozen anymore. You can make your samples and send them off because if you wait till closer to planting time, you may not get the results back in time, because they get really bogged down with people asking for tests. And once you have your soil amended, then you're going to, once you have your soil test results back, then you're going to prepare the flower bed by removing any sod, any stones, and then adding your amendments. There we go. So making a plan for your garden. Once you've thought about all you've thought about your goals, you've thought about your limitations, now it's time to think about, all right, what exactly am I going to put in this garden? What shape is it going to be? How am I going to arrange the plants? And there are some, it's personal preference in large part, but there are some basics that can make your flower garden really shine. And one of them is by graduating the heights of plants. If you're viewing your garden from one side, maybe it's up against a house or up against a fence or up against some bushes, you're going to put the tall plants in the back and step down to the shorter plants along the front. On the other hand, if you're going to be viewing your garden from all sides, maybe it's going to be circular or an island bed out in the middle of your lawn, then you're going to want to put your tall plants in the center and step down from there to both edges. And then you'll be able to see your plants from every view and none will block the other. I think it's a good idea, not only for the sake of the pollinators, but for visual impact, to mass your plants, mass your colors. I like to plant in groups of at least 3. So if I'm planting daisies, I'll put in 3 plants of daisies in sort of a triangular arrangement. 5 is even better. If you can repeat it along the length of your garden, it will really help your eye travel along the garden. If you can repeat colors and color blocks, that always looks good. But you make much more of a statement if you plant in large groups than, 1 zinnia here, 1 marigold there, 1 cosmos there. That doesn't make nearly as much impact as a whole swath of yellow cosmos together. And then, as we said before, you should consider bloom time. So if you've got something in one area that's going to bloom in the fall, right next to it, perhaps, or on either side of it, you should have something that's going to bloom in the middle of the summer. And then maybe behind that, you're going to have something that has bloomed already in the spring, so that there's always something blooming. And if you know a plant is going to bloom and then look a little tattered when it's done, having something next to it that will sort of fill in around it and hide the foliage that's starting to decline keeps your garden looking nice. Now it's time to plant your garden. So the first thing you should do is select your plants carefully. When you're looking at the plants at the garden center, be careful to look for plants that look healthy, not yellowed, not straggly, certainly not with any insect holes or critters around the soil level. It's absolutely fine to turn the pot over and take the pot off and take a look at the roots and make sure the roots look healthy. Usually in the spring, you're going to find potted plants with pretty healthy roots and some good amount of soil around the roots. But as the season goes on and those plants have been sitting at the garden center for a couple months, they can get what we call root bound. The roots have grown around and around and around inside that little pot, and they're, just jammed in there. That's not necessarily a plant to avoid altogether, especially if it's discounted, because with a little TLC, you can have a really good plant. But you need to allow for that. When you're planting it, you want to gently tease the root ball open and loosen the roots a little bit so that they can go out into the soil, because you don't want all the roots to stay in one place. You want the roots to spread out in the soil to obtain nutrients to make a nice, strong base for your plant. The planting depth should match the depth that the plant is in its pot. So in other words, the soil level of the plant in the pot should be the same when you put it in the ground. Don't plant it deeper. Don't plant it so that it's up above and sort of hanging out in midair. You want it to be even with the soil that it was in the pot. We always say, dig a $20 hole for a $10 plant. That means if the pot is this big, you don't dig your hole this big, you dig it bigger. Not necessarily deeper, because you want it to be at the right level, but wide enough that the roots can spread out. And then you need to think about when you're going to plant things. As I said, there are annuals that can be planted quite early because they're frost tolerant, and other annuals that if you planted them now, they would die because we're going to have a frost soon. So if you're planting spring bulbs like daffodils or crocuses or hyacinths, you're going to put those in the fall, and they will bloom the following year. If you're planting annuals, you're going to put them in the spring, either early spring if they're frost tolerant, or in May if they're not frost tolerant. Perennials can be planted almost any time in the growing season, as long as the soil is workable. Now, there are ideal times to plant perennials. The best time is in spring or in fall, because it's not the hottest time that's going to stress the plant. They'll have time to develop roots and get strong before they have to live through the winter. So the best time to plant most perennials is like soon, this spring, and maybe stop by June. And then in late August, September, October might be pushing it, but late August and September, you can plant perennials because they'll have enough time to develop roots in the ground before it gets cold and the ground freezes. That said, you can plant perennials all through the summer. I wouldn't plant it on a 95-degree day or in the middle of a drought. But if you take care of them, water them, protect them from the sun, you can plant perennials all through the summer. I've done it. There's no garden that is completely maintenance-free. But as I said, there are ways to reduce maintenance. Now, the regular maintenance you're probably going to have to do is Watering, that's important. And it's important to water the roots, not the leaves. If you keep the leaves wet, you're encouraging fungal diseases. If you keep the water at the roots where the plant can use it, that will be less likely to encourage mildews, molds, and other fungal diseases. You want your plants to develop deep, strong roots. If the roots have to go down deep into the soil to get the water, then in times of drought, they will be better able to withstand the dry conditions. If you sprinkle a little bit every day, the roots stay up near the surface of the soil. They never go down deep. And so you have a dry week and the plant really suffers. But if you water deeply, but less often, then the water percolates down through the soil and the roots have to reach to get them. And the roots will develop deeper and stronger, and the plant will be more tolerant of changes in weather and water conditions. One way to reduce your maintenance is to use mulch. If you have a good organic mulch on your soil, it will keep the temperature of the soil more even. And that will help during the heat of summer and the dry times, and it will keep the weeds down. And it will also reduce the amount that you have to water the plants. Deadheading means removing spent flowers. This is important for annuals to keep the annuals blooming. If you let the annuals go to seed, sometimes they will stop blooming. It's important for perennials too, but you have to balance deadheading perennials with your goals. If you're trying to encourage birds to come to your gardens, you might want your perennials to go to seed because the birds will eat the seeds. I kind of do a mixture of both. Near the front door, near the front path where you enter my home, I tend to cut back the dead flowers and keep things looking tidy. But farther out in my yard where it's a little less noticeable, I let them go. And then all winter long, I can see the goldfinches and the other birds on the dead plant stalks eating those aster and coneflower and goldenrod seeds. Another chore that is necessary with perennials is dividing. Not all perennials need to be divided on a regular basis, but many do. And you'll know it's time to divide your perennials if you see that they are blooming less and less each year, or if you've got a mound of a perennial and the center seems to be dead, but it's green around the outside, that perennial needs to be dug up, separated into smaller plants, and replanted. That's the time to share with your friends when you're dividing your perennials. There are some perennials that need to be divided on a regular basis. German bearded iris are one. If you don't divide them every 2 to 3 years, they will stop blooming. On the other hand, peonies never need to be divided. You can leave peonies in the same spot as long as you feed them well, because they're heavy feeders, for 20, 30 years, and they'll keep blooming and blooming and blooming. They like to be left alone. So it depends on what you're growing, whether you're going to have to divide them. And if you don't want to divide them, you pick plants that don't have to be divided. Now, I love all flowers, and it's hard for me to say, don't plant this, do plant that, because they're all beautiful. But for a beginning gardener, there are some you might want to avoid. And over the years, I've found that there are some that to me are just not worth the effort. And it's a matter of personal preference. I happen to think petunias are a pain in the neck. They're beautiful, but they don't like the heat. So they bloom and bloom and bloom, and then July hits and they quit, and they look scraggly and yucky, and they're not blooming at all. And you got to cut them way back. And then in maybe 6 weeks, you're going to get another flush of bloom. But that means you got a month to 6 weeks of nothing in your garden. So I've stopped growing petunias. And then there are the plants with very short bloom times. This is a picture of oriental poppies from my yard. I love them. They're beautiful, but they bloom for 2 days, and that's it. And the rest of the time, the leaves don't look that pretty. So to me, it's worth it because I've got a pretty big garden and the tatty leaves are going to be hidden by the other things that I grow around them. But I will admit that there are some years where it rains on the day or two that they're going to bloom and I get nothing. So that might not be the best choice for a beginning gardener. And then there are the plants that are very disease prone or insect prone. Garden phlox is a wonderful garden plant. I have a lot of them in my garden. The pollinators love them. They smell good, but they tend to get powdery mildew. And it's not easy to get rid of without a lot of trouble. So that might not be the best choice for your first flower garden. Oriental lilies, beautiful plant, pretty easy to grow, makes a great cut flower. But in our area, they are prone to the lily leaf beetle, which just eats them down to the ground. And I spent 4 or 5 years trying to battle those bugs. And I finally gave up and let the lilies die and have not replanted them because it's just too much work. And it's heartbreaking when you're expecting to see this beautiful stargazer lily and you get nothing. And then there are the plants that need to be staked or they flop over. Now, there are a lot of beautiful garden plants that have to be staked or in the first rain or wind, they're going to be flopping down. And I stake a lot of my plants. But if you don't want to bother with that, don't plant things like that. You know, peonies are an example. I understand the modern varieties of peonies will stand up and hold their flowers up. But mine are from my mother's garden and they're 40 years old. So they're old varieties and they just go unless I, tie them up, wire them up. You don't even see the flower if you don't stake those plants. It's a lot of extra work. To me, it's worth it, but it might not be to you. So those are plants you might want to avoid. There are plenty of places to get ideas for what to put in your garden. One of the best ways to get ideas for what grows well in Connecticut, what different flowers look like are display gardens. And Elizabeth Park is a terrific place to go. They have, beside their beautiful rose garden, they have one garden devoted to annuals, another garden devoted to perennials, another garden devoted to shade plants. They have a beautiful bulb display in the spring. You visit them at different times of the years and you'll get plenty of inspiration. Then there's your neighbor's gardens. If you pass somebody's house and they have a beautiful display of daylilies, that can give you an idea of what to plant in your own yard because you know it grows well in Southington. And you might make a new friend if you stop by and say, gee, what is that plant you've got out by your mailbox? I really like it. They may even offer to give you one. And then there are the garden catalogs and online sites and even plant tags at nurseries. Almost all the garden companies now have online presences where you can order your seeds and plants right online. But I really love looking through a garden catalog, just pouring through the pages and saying, oh, that's a pretty flower. Oh, I wish I could grow this. Oh, I think I'll try this next year. Garden catalogs are a wonderful source of inspiration. Reputable garden centers. If you go to a big box store, they sell lots of plants, but they don't know anything about plants. They're just there to sell to you. And what they have for sale is not necessarily something that will grow well in your yard. But if you go to a garden center where they know their stuff, they will point you in the right direction and answer your questions. Winterberry Gardens in Southington, Nature Works down in Northford, White Flower Farm in Litchfield. Those people know about plants, they know about gardens, and they can help you. And finally, our library. Our library is chock full of books on every topic related to gardening. And that will not only give you ideas, but answer your questions and give you directions on how to do things. Now, planting a flower garden is a big topic. I can do an entire presentation, and I have, on daylilies, just one flower, one kind of plant. And the list is on and on and on. There are experts in dahlias and experts in roses and experts in irises. So today I tried to cover a little bit about a lot for flower gardens, and maybe it feels a little overwhelming, but just give it a try. Start small. Start a small garden and see how it goes. The great thing about gardening is there's always next year. If it doesn't work out the way you hoped this year, you start again next spring. Try just container gardens, a couple of pots this year, and next year maybe a couple of hanging pots, and the next year maybe you'll branch out into a little patch around your mailbox. Try planting one flower, but a lot of it. Make a beautiful statement. It may not bloom all summer or all season, but it's a great way to get started. And then there are the pre-planned gardens. I mentioned White Flower Farm. If you get their catalog, they have several pre-planned gardens where they've chosen the varieties, they've chosen flowers that look good together, that have a succession of bloom, and they're designed for sun, or they're designed for part sun, or they're designed for containers, or they're designed for shade. You can just buy a garden that's already planned out for you and get beautiful results, and then go from there. There are lots of sources for more information on this topic. UConn has a website, ladybug.uconn.edu. That's the UConn Home and Garden Center. And they have fact sheets that you can print out on just about every topic in gardening that there is. You can also ask a master gardener. The Hartford County Extension Service, which is located in the Exchange Building in Farmington, is staffed by knowledgeable master gardeners. You can give them a call with your question. You can stop by. You can email them. You can bring them a leaf of your plant and say, you know, what are these spots on this plant? And they will research and answer your questions and point you in the right direction. And then my garden club is full of people who are passionate about plants and very knowledgeable about plants. Come to a meeting. We'd love to have you. We just ask that guests pay a $5 donation to defray the cost of programs. We have a different program every month. It's the fourth Tuesday of every month at 10 o'clock in the morning at the American Legion Hall here in Southington. Our next meeting is Tuesday, April 26th. And Sebi Milano, plantsman Sebi Milano from Winterberry Gardens, is going to be talking about what's new for the garden in 2022. He's a very entertaining speaker, and he usually brings plants from Winterberry to show and to raffle off. So it's a fun day. We'd love to get to know you, and we'd love to have you join. But if you have any questions now for me, this is the time to put them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer.
All right, so there are a fair number of questions in the chat, though I think that William has attempted to answer a bunch of them.
Thanks, Bill.
All right, so someone says, plant seedlings and then mulch around the seedlings, or mulch and then temporarily push mulch aside to plant the seedlings?
You can do either. Whichever, it can depend on the size of the seedlings. It's a little easier to mulch around a big plant than it is a little teeny tiny plant, because you don't want to have the mulch come up too close to the roots and keep moisture around the stems and promote rot. So either way is actually fine.
Okay. So Anna says, if not in patience, What blooms nicely if full north side shade?
Full north side shade. That's a tough one. There are plenty of native plants, native perennials that will bloom in full shade. Chrysogonum, Katie, is that how you say it? Golden star is the common name. Okay, let me think. Hellebores, Christmas roses grow in deep shade. Trying to think back to what's blooming in my yard right now. Wood poppies, trillium, heuchera. Let me think. What else grows? Periwinkle is a ground cover that grows in deep shade. As far as annuals for deep shade, begonias, wax begonias, they will grow in deep shade. Impatience is the tried and true. Katie, you want to weigh in on this?
I think I.
Oh, you're echoing.
Not gonna work.
Maybe you can write your answer in the chat, Katie, because you probably got some ideas that I haven't thought of. Oh, Iris cristata, that blooms in pretty deep shade. Yeah, a lot of native perennials will grow in deep shade. There are some native geraniums that will grow in deep shade, that will bloom in deep shade. There are choices. They're fewer, but they do exist.
Oh.
And many hostas bloom in the shade too.
Yes. All right. So Katie's trying to get in. So, okay, so there is, someone wants to know what time the meeting is on the 26th?
10 o'clock. We're usually there from about 9:30 to 10:15.
Okay. All right. And okay. Says Easter bulbs and tulips, can they be planted after blooming?
So you're talking about buying blooming plants. You know, you can go to the Agway and pick up a pot of hyacinths or tulips that are blooming right now. Yes, you can plant them after they're done blooming. They may need a year or two to bloom again because they've been forced to bloom, and that saps a lot of energy from the bulb. But yeah, I would absolutely put them in the ground.
Okay. All right. So that's actually all the questions.
Bill, you must have done a good job answering.
Oh,
them.
he did. So yeah. So if anyone else has a question, just pop it in the box. Otherwise, we'll see you next month for Put Some Life in Your Landscaping.
I will say that besides coming to meetings, the Garden Club has a website. You just search for Orchard Valley Garden Club, and we also have a Facebook page, so you can get information from both of those sources.
Okay.
Browalia, okay.
Yep.
Katie just added that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a little harder to find shade blooming plants than plants that bloom in the sun, but you have to search for them a little bit, but they do exist.
Yep.
And we will definitely have some at our plant sale.
Oh, yes. Ooh, maybe we should have you back to do a shade gardening program.
There you go. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yes, it's going to frost tonight.
Yes.
So as long as you haven't put out your annuals yet, you're good. It's too early for most things.
Yes. Yes. Even though the desire is there.
Desire is there.
Yep.
Yes, epimediums are also good for deep shade. They're teeny tiny little flowers, but easy plants to grow. And they will take dry shade, which is often a problem on the north side.
Yes. All right then. Thank everyone. Thank you all for coming. So glad you joined us this evening. Registration is open for next month's program, which is landscape. And then the month after that, not the year. Time is going so fast. The month after that, we'll be doing native plants. So you can find both of those events on our events calendar at southingtonlibrary.org. You can register through the calendar on our website, or you can stop by the reference desk or give us a call and we'll sign you up. The format is the same for all of our programs. You can come to the library and watch it in our cafe space on our big TV and talk to other people, or you can stay home and enjoy your pajamas and Zoom. All right. So
thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Lynn, for this opportunity.
I'm so glad you could come out. This is great. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. Appreciate your talk.